In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
Today I'm talking with Matt Hancock, who's heavily involved with the cooperative movement in Emilia Romagna, the region of Italy around Bologna. There's a huge, very successful cooperative sector in Emilia Romagna. Hi, Matt.
Good morning, Dave. No, it's afternoon. Yes, I've moved into the afternoon. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. What I want to try and find out in this interview is why. What's special about Emilia Romagna, and can it be emulated elsewhere? That's the main thing I want to get to. But first, I want to talk a little bit.
You're going to start with an easier question first, right?
Yeah. Yes, I'll start with an easier question first. Yes, let's talk about you first. So the first thing I've got to ask this. I guess you know that there's a politician in the UK who shares your name. He's not exactly a national treasure.
Well, I guess we have two things in common. I'm not a national treasure either, and we also have almost exactly the same birth date. I think he's born in 1978 in October, and there is where the similarities end.
Thank God for that, or it would be a very difficult interview.
Yes. I prefer when people compare me to the Will Smith hero Hancock from the movie Hancock than to your former health minister.
So yes. So how did you get into cooperatives, and what's your role now, or what has been your role in Emilia Romagna?
So I guess the quick answer is completely by accident. It goes back to 2002, 2003. I had graduated college in 2001. I was a student activist, so I was politically engaged. I was organizing around different, some electoral issues, but mostly around environmental issues. I graduate college in 2001. I move out to Chicago from upstate New York, where I was in college. I'm actually originally from New Jersey, born and raised. So my apologies to everybody who might be listening to this for that, but I was born there.
Hang on a bit. Why are you apologizing for coming?
Well, there's usually, somebody usually has something about New Jersey that they don't like.
Okay.
And so, it's our maybe our unrefined nature, the highways, the refineries, but we've got lots of wonderful things in the Garden State.
Okay.
So I go out to Chicago to sort of pursue being a student activist. I was part of founding a national organization that was sort of an umbrella organization connecting student chapters of a group called Campus Green. So interested in electoral reform, interested in environmental issues and campaign finance reform. So trying to sort of restore democracy to citizens by getting corporate money out of elections. I worked down. Oh, go ahead.
Go on.
Oh, sorry. I worked down the hall from a guy named Dan Swinney at a place called the Center for Labor and Community Research. And I asked him to participate in a training for our student organizers that we were going to hold in Chicago. And he said, well, everything you're talking about is really interesting, but there's only one problem. I know exactly what you're against, but I don't know what you're for. What kind of a world do you want to build? Not just what do you want to oppose in the world as it is?
Yeah.
And that sort of got the wheels turning. I started to work for him, actually. My other passion, aside from activism, had always been Italy and all things Italian. So I had already spent a year living in Italy in a place called Urbino, in the northern central region, a little bit south of where Bologna is. I guess south and east. And so I had these sort of competing passions. I always saw going to live in Italy as being very self-indulgent. And, so I chose student activism, but I was always feeling this pull towards Italy. So I finally decided that I wanted to go move to Italy. I picked Bologna. And I don't say this to be tongue in cheek, but I knew that it was a nice city because I'd been there once. I knew that it had a good reputation in terms of the university. I didn't know it was the oldest university in the world at the time and one of the top ranked in the world. And I had gone there a couple of years earlier, and I'd seen a really good Led Zeppelin cover band in the basement of the Irish pub by the university. So I thought, well, let's go to Bologna. I told my boss then that I was going to do this. He said, that's great news. You can go study co-ops, you can go study unions, and you can go study this model called the Emilian model. So he put me in touch with
the Emilian model. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. I think the first time that somebody wrote about the Emilia model was probably the late 70s or the early 80s. I knew nothing about it. So that got me on sort of two tracks. One was a track where because of a professor named Stefano Zamagni, who's got lots of great stuff written in English about sort of the economic theory behind cooperatives. He had started a number of years earlier a master's in cooperative economics. So I think of it as an executive MBA for people who want to go be management in cooperatives. So he recruited me to study cooperative economics at the University of Bologna in the economics school. And I also was able to work at a place called the Institute for Labor, which was doing something very interesting, looking at the small and medium firms in Emilia Romagna, because let me take a quick step back. The cooperative movement is one of the really very interesting things about the region here. The other interesting thing is that they, produce really high-tech things like packaging equipment, like Ducati motorcycles and Ferrari race cars, but they do those things primarily through networks of small and medium businesses that are each highly specialized, that compete and collaborate in a network. We used to talk about it as industrial districts. So with the Institute for Labor, I was studying these small and medium firms. And I was studying things like worker participation and innovation. So co-ops, labor, and worker participation and innovation were sort of those three threads that I followed while I was here. And I was here between 2003, 4, 5, 6. I came back to the United States then in 2006, and I spent 9 years in Chicago as a social entrepreneur, and then the last 6 years in the United States in Philadelphia as an organization development consultant, working not with cooperatives, because there's very few worker-owned cooperatives in the United States, but there's a lot of employee stock ownership plan, so employee-owned companies. So I did organization development work, working around employee participation in those firms. In 2021, the very beginning, I moved back with my 2 kids to Bologna, where I've been very active in research in both cooperatives, as well as working with the labor union here, looking at things like digital transformation. How does that affect workers? How does it affect the quality of work and collective bargaining? So those are sort of the things that I'm involved in right now. And I guess the thing that has me most curious right now as it relates to cooperatives is this notion of what is the identity of the cooperative movement? How is that a strength? And how does the cooperative movement think about creating space for people who don't traditionally identify in that way to find a home within the cooperative movement? Maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just lead the conversation. So let's talk a little bit about Emilia Romagna. Am I pronouncing it right for a start? Emilia Romagna.
Excellent.
Okay. Yeah.
Excellent.
So tell us more about the co-op sector there. What's the Emilia model?
Well, I mean, the Emilia model is it's not just co-ops. And actually, interestingly, when the scholars typically talk about the Emilian model, and there's a great book written in English called The New Industrial Divide by Piore and Sable. They're out of MIT, and they did a really good job capturing a lot of what made the model unique. So people start studying the Emilian model in the 70s and the 80s, when big business, so traditional Taylorist, Fordist manufacturing was in crisis in Europe and in the United States especially. And they were looking for alternatives. And so, of course, one alternative is Toyota and lean production. And what Fiore and Sable got onto was maybe there was something that was neither mass production, that was neither lean manufacturing, but it was this third way, which was around small. And when I say small and medium, I think the English-speaking, Anglo world, United States, UK, Canada, we're really talking about micro and small enterprises.
Okay.
So if you have tea in your home in in prepackaged tea bags, not loose tea, the equipment, the production line that took the loose tea, that put it into those bags, that tied those bags up, put the string on it with the tag, that put each of those bags into the individual paper sleeve, that put them very rapidly into the box, closed the box, and put the cellophane in the box. That production line was probably made right here in Bologna. Right. And there's, but it was the way it was made was by these networks of micro and small businesses, which were typically started by skilled workers collaborating in a very horizontal fashion. And so, so that's kind of what. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask. So, do you think the average size of businesses in Emilia Romagna is smaller than average in Italy or elsewhere?
It is teeny tiny. I mean, we're talking, it's between 5 and 10 employees probably on average.
And why is that?
Well, I think part of it is it's a characteristic of Italy and the Italian economy. There's very few large businesses. I mean, Fiat is an exception. Ducati motorcycle is very large and they have less than 2,000 employees. Mm-hmm. So part of it is a characteristic of the Italian economy. But when you look at the Emilia Romagna model, it's not just about being small, it's about being small and very agile. And so at a certain point, when a firm gets to be too big, usually somebody, a skilled worker, says, I don't want to work for somebody else anymore. I'm going to go into business for myself. They spin off, they take their expertise, they maybe get some equipment loaned, production equipment loaned to them from the business that they left, and they'll get some orders from the business where they used to work from. Right. And so what this does is no business gets too top heavy. It doesn't get laden with high fixed costs. It allows for an incredible amount of diversification. So I'm really specialized in the process that I do. So maybe my process is using cutting metal, or it's forming metal through a process, that's about spinning metal. So like turning, lathes, that kind of a thing. So I get very specialized, in a particular process, but I don't get specialized in terms of product or markets. Mm-hmm. So I could be doing things that are supporting packaging machinery, that are into automotive manufacturing. And so they talk about, instead of economy of scale, which is the old Western, mass production, economy of scope. So I'm highly specialized.
Why does that happen in Italy more than in other European countries, do you think? Is something in the Italian character, or?
Italian business. So first of all, there's very little. There's not a lot of big sources of capital. Investors. Even if you look at the larger enterprises, like Turin is where if you want to go see more mass production, you go to the north of Italy. Mm-hmm. Most of those industries can only exist because of massive state support. Because Italy has never had and I think this is actually not a controversial, this is not a political statement, but Italy's never had a particularly highly developed independent bourgeoisie, mm-hmm. and unlike other countries. And so some of it has to do with the way Italian capitalism developed. Some of it has to do with the education that skilled workers received in the region. So it put these skilled workers in a position to be able to go spin off businesses and start their own firms. And this process of spinning off happens to this very day. So there's something that's cultural about it. There's something that is, well, if we don't have access to, big sources of capital, we can't, you simply can't build a River Rouge plant in a Ford Motor Company style vertically integrated manufacturing, because we just don't have the manufacturing. So how are we going to meet our needs? I think another part of the story, and I'm not an economic historian, so I'm going to give you bits and pieces of the story, but some of it also has to do with the way the Italian economy developed in between. I'm sorry, the way it was developing before World War I and after World War II. So you had an internal market, and it was largely serviced by internally.
Mm-hmm.
And so, particularly in the post-war boom in this region, you had a massive move from, sharecropping didn't end in this region until the 1950s.
Wow.
So you had this, right after the war, this massive move from the fields to the factories. And you had the, shift from sharecropping to more modern agriculture. And so people needed things like tractors, they needed agricultural implements. And so it was the local businesses. So Lamborghini, I don't know if you know this, before they started making fancy luxury race cars, they made tractors. And so there's
Lamborghini tractors, yeah, doesn't roll off the tongue, does it?
Exactly. So you've got the development of the internal market. There's a demand for things like tractors and agricultural implements, and these small and medium-sized firms of people who had fought in the resistance or who are now unemployed spring up to service those internal customers. And I think they started at some point to realize, okay, we can't compete by doing mass production because we simply don't have the means to do that. But maybe we have an advantage because we're nimble and we don't have these high fixed costs by developing these networks. These flexible manufacturing networks is what it began to be called.
And so the cooperative aspect, how do you think? I mean, first of all, how big is it? How big is the cooperative sector in Emilia Romagna?
So I think two ways to answer that. One is, some history. The earliest co-ops, and some of them are still surviving, are still powerhouses to this day, go back to the mid to late 1800s in Italy. So they're developing worker ownership, and cooperatives are developing right alongside capitalism. So it's not sort of capitalism develops and then there's a reaction to it, so let's do co-ops. They're part and parcel of the development of industry and capitalism in Italy, in particular in this region. So the earliest, worker buyout or maybe conversion from private to cooperative ownership it's called Cooperativa Ceramica. It's a cooperative ceramic producer in this region, which is, one of the top in the world to this day. And that goes back to the 1870s, maybe, when that firm was turned over to the workers. So it has deep roots historically, right along the development of the modern economy in the region. In terms of how important is it, and I think that's one of the things where when you start reading about the Emilia Romagna, so Peoria and Sable in the second industrial divide, that's what it is, the second industrial divide, not the new industrial divide. They don't talk about co-ops. And I think you're missing a big part of the story if you don't talk about co-ops, because you've got, for a region of just under 5 million people, around 4,000 cooperative businesses. Wow. They do about 45 billion in revenue in a year, and they employ, I think, 250,000 people. So that's just under a quarter of the entire workforce in the region is employed.
A quarter of the entire workforce of Emilia Romagna is employed in co-ops.
Yeah.
Well, that's incredible. What's special about Emilia Romagna? Are there strong cooperative values? Have there always been strong cooperative values in the region?
Yeah, I think part of the answer is yes, there have always been strong cooperative values. So the cooperative labor movement both go back to the mutual aid societies, the workers' mutual aid societies in the 1800s. And there's a propensity towards doing things together in this region. So creating an association, joining a union, starting a co-op, creating a credit union. There's sort of a sense and this goes back to the 1800s, that we've just got to solve these problems together, not alone. There's also, this is something that I only started noticing recently because people pointed out to me more recently. While we live in a highly successful economy, it's highly innovative. It's recognized as one of the most innovative in Europe. At an individual level, it's probably one of the least competitive. So it's not that the businesses aren't competing, but at an individual level, there isn't that sense of competition that is particularly, I think, you have in the Anglo-Saxon world.
Yeah.
Certainly not in the United States. So there is something that's very cultural and very deep-seated. Go ahead.
But is that Italy or Emilia Romagna?
In Emilia Romagna. In Emilia Romagna.
And why do you think? What's special? How did it come about there?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think.
And can we bottle it?
So I think you can't bottle the origins, but I think you can certainly replicate what they've done here, because at the end of the day, if you look at the practices that make co-ops successful today, and you trace them back to their origins, it was a person or a group of people who said, we're going to do it this way because it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. There's tax benefits now, there's investment vehicles now, but those things all followed. There's legislation that's supportive of, but those things all followed by decades, the practices. Mm-hmm. But you know, I think there is something, there is a culture in Italian society in general, but in particular in this region, that is less individualistic, that is about, so even if you look at private businesses, they're part of associations because they're meeting their needs together. They're doing joint purchasing. They're lobbying, you know, together. They're collectively bargaining with unions through an employer association. So there is something about the culture. But, you know, so for example, one of the things that Westerners, that, you know, that people from the English-speaking world, I think, will oftentimes latch onto in terms of what makes the co-op successful is that they have a form of limited equity that's made up of retained earnings. And there's a significant tax benefit to the co-op if they retain earnings in this form of limited equity that they call indivisible reserves, which means you can use it to grow the co-op, but you can never use it to benefit an individual member individually. So you can't pay patronage dividends.
A shareholder, you mean?
The shareholder, yeah. Well, in the co-op, I mean.
In the co-op, yeah.
So the shareholder, the member of the co-op.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times people say, well, if only we had that law in the United States, for example, we could do more co-ops. Well, that law came, oh boy, I don't know, 80, 90 years after they first started doing that.
Right.
And it was just because people said, let's do this. We need to self-finance the co-op. It's not to my benefit individually, but it's to the benefit of future generations. And so there is a mentality, and I think this is unique here, that says we have to exist to benefit future generations. The co-op doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the community and it belongs to future generations. Public sector, the government in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, a lot of the region here, this is now I think it's where most agriculture is, most agricultural goods are produced in Italy in this region. That wasn't so 100 years ago, 150 years ago, because it was mostly underwater, swampy, swampland. And so they reclaimed the land, the public, you know, the municipalities would fund it, and they would hire worker co-ops that were formed in order to reclaim the land to do it. And so one of the largest construction and civil engineering co-ops in Italy, it now does work all over the world, got their start in the late 1800s, early 1900s, draining the swamps, literally, to create, you know, the agricultural the lands that we have now.
Yeah. I mean, what kinds of shared values are needed to build supportive cooperative networks? I mean, for example, the ultimate aims are different, aren't they? It's you want to grow a cooperative network rather than profit. Money as a means rather than an end.
Yeah, I think that people, if you look back, particularly to the 1950s, the immediate post-war period, there was an entrepreneurial spirit. combined with a sense of that the value of doing things collectively, and an emphasis on what can we do for future generations. I might not benefit from this. I mean, people didn't get paid when they first started their co-ops, but they were willing to make that sacrifice because they knew their kids would benefit from it, and their children's children would benefit from that. And so I think it's, maybe it sounds trite in 2023 to say something like that, but I do think if you look at the origins of that, that those values were at the core of what they were doing. Because why do that versus a private business?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just explain it using sort of an economic, rational economic model. So there was something about the intersection of values and economics that came together. I think if you look at why people do co-ops today, they're responding to things like plant closures. And so the workers are saying, and I guess maybe there's if you look at there's the book by Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And, Milton Friedman advocates for exit. If you don't like it, change your job. If you don't like it, buy a different product.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hirschman says there's also voice. And so there's an opportunity to stick with it and try to use your voice to change the organization. So I think
Like a worker buyout or something like that.
Yeah, so I think when confronted with a crisis in a business, Italians are less likely to say, well, I got to go look for another job. And they're more likely to say, how do I solve this problem? And so the union, the local government, I'm talking about present day, will get together with those workers in a business that's in crisis, and they'll try to figure out, how do we either find another buyer for the plant to keep it open and keep the jobs there, or how do we convert it into a co-op? And so you have bank financing specifically to do that. Workers can put their future unemployment benefits as a down payment to their capital formation. And there are specific financing options through the cooperative movement. So the cooperative movement taxes itself 3% of the profits of every cooperative in Italy. This is not just in Emilia Romagna, go into an investment fund to benefit.
Oh, right. Okay, I wanted to talk about that. 3% of the profits of every co-op in Italy.
Every co-op
go into a fund.
Yep.
to support the cooperative network in Italy.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I think the other thing is, there's what you're seeing now is people saying, we want to solve the climate crisis, and we know we have to move to a renewable energy production. So wind and solar primarily. I mean, Italy's got lots of sun. And they're saying, well, we're not going to wait for the private sector to do that. This is citizens, people in communities. And we're not going to wait for the government to do that. So we're going to use a co-op to create, to install solar, and we're going to buy the solar energy from our own co-op. The first electric car charging stations in Italy were from this region, in a town not far from here, that were started by people who said, I don't want to drive an internal combustion engine vehicle anymore, but I have no means of charging an electric vehicle. So let's create a co-op to create a network of charging stations.
Are those kind of cooperative values growing in Emilia Romagna, or shrinking, or how are those values nurtured?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have a really good answer. I think there's concern about are those values growing or not, because you're not seeing the levels of startup of new cooperatives that I think the cooperative movement would like to see. So on the one hand, there's lots of members. Let me see here, it's over 3 million members. This is spread across agriculture co-ops, consumer co-ops, services, and manufacturing, but it's a big membership base.
In Italy?
In Emilia Romagna.
3 million members of co-ops?
3,600 co-ops, 3 million members.
In a population of 5 million?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So, I mean, a lot of it is because, where do you go shopping? You go shopping at a grocery store called the Co-op. My bank account is with a credit union. a lot of the biggest manufacturing and the large agricultural, the value added, the people who are processing food are farmer-owned cooperatives. So it's a major economic force employing lots of people with lots of members. I think that there is a concern though around, young people who want to be social entrepreneurs, right? The dominant sort of Silicon Valley startup model is captured the imagination of young people. I think there's a sense that there's some distance between disadvantaged groups and the cooperative movement today, even though the cooperative movement is very strong in the social sector. So providing home health care, operating daycares, operating old people's homes, helping the ex-incarcerated assimilate back into society. A lot of these services are provided by social cooperatives. There is some concern around the rate of startup of new co-ops, and I think that's something that the movement is really trying to tackle.
Okay, yeah, in the capitalist world, entrepreneurs go to banks or they sell shares in their companies, and tech businesses release tokens, or they have an ICO. Or how do cooperative entrepreneurs get the money to start up or buy out? How do they share risks and rewards with investors, or how do they do it?
Yeah, I think there's two ways. One is highly consistent with cooperative values, so no question about it. And I personally take out a loan in the case of a worker buyout. The Italian law allows you to take your future unemployment benefits that I haven't not gotten and invest them up front into starting a co-op. There's the 3 cooperative investment funds that are funded by the 3% tax, self-tax. And so they'll make loans to new cooperatives, or they'll go in as an investor and put in some patient capital along with technical support.
Who administers that fund?
So there's the cooperative business associations, the apex organizations, and there's 3: a red one, a right one, and a blue and a green one. So the colors of the Italian flag is the historic socialist and communist, historically socialist, Republican, communist, and Christian Democrat. Those political differences are less important today, but there still are 3 separate organizations, each with their own fund.
Right. So that's what I wanted to ask as well. For the cooperative values and the belief in the cooperative movement, is it spread across the whole political spectrum?
Yeah, it's literally the whole political spectrum. So you've got even to sort of make the point dramatically, in the 1920s and 30s, one of the things that the fascists did was they attacked the cooperative movement. They burned down the headquarters. They killed and maimed cooperators, but they also started cooperatives because part of what fascism was doing, and the right more generally, right, is how do we co-opt these sort of popular movements and impulses. And so to this day, there's very few right-wing co-ops, but they exist. So yeah, it cuts across the political spectrum. To say that if you're involved in a co-op, somebody is from the left it's just inaccurate. In a region like Emilia Romagna, where historically the left political tradition has been strongest, it is a good bet. But there's lots of people who don't identify with the left, who do identify with the cooperative movement. So to get back to your question about financing for co-ops, both expansion and the startup, you've got investment capital administered by funds that are ultimately governed by the cooperative movement themselves, and so they'll make loans or they'll come in as investors, with sort of a 5 to 7 year time horizon. Those funds, and then there's an expectation that individuals will put their own money into starting up a co-op. There's a real belief that I have to make a sacrifice individually. And then the other way that co-ops, that maybe the cooperative movement expands, is sort of an indirect way, and that is, I'm an existing cooperative I'm going to purchase an existing privately owned business and absorb that into the co-op, either directly or through a holding company. Or I'm going to start up a wholly owned subsidiary of the co-op. So I'll give you an example. There's a milk co-op called Granarolo, which is based right outside of Bologna, and it's one of the largest milk producers. And the cooperative is a traditional dairy co-op. The farmers sell their milk to the co-op. Well, the milk is packaged and is marketed not by the co-op directly, but by a wholly owned, by a subsidiary of the co-op, which is a privately held joint stock company. And they just raised some capital. So the milk, the company that has the name of the co-op that does the processing, the distribution, and the marketing, they needed some additional capital. And so two outside investors put in over 100 million euros. The cooperative also put in, I think, about 30 million euros out of the co-op's own funds to increase the capital in the wholly owned subsidiary, which is not a co-op, it's a privately owned company. So there's lots of examples of that happening where the co-op is the majority shareholder, or they're the majority owned shareholder in an investment fund that owns the private company, and they're using either the stock market or other private investors as a way of leveraging the capitalist sort of mainstream economy to pump additional funds into businesses that are owned by the cooperatives. So I don't know if that was clear what I'm.
Yeah, but does that working with private investors cause any problems in as much as wealth being extracted from Emilia Romagna to pay the investors back, to reward the investors? Is there any extraction problems?
I think that if you look at the manufacturing companies, for example, I would say no. The model is whatever we do has to strengthen the cooperative, and the cooperative is the patrimony. I mean, this is one quote that one of the cooperatives said to me, and I've got a couple of papers that you can find online that have written about this. He said, no, the cooperative is the patrimony of the local community.
If you could send me, I'll put some links in the description.
Absolutely.
So have a deeper dive.
Absolutely. And so the logic is anything I do has to strengthen the cooperative. So if we're going to put our capital at risk to go buy a competitor that's maybe in trouble, we've got to be really sure that that's going to be a successful merger. So I think by and large it's done in a way that strengthens the cooperative, that creates dividends for the local community.
And how do you ensure that it benefits the cooperative movement more than external investors?
Well, so I think that's where you get into. So there's how do you do that? That's a good question. I mean, I think those are really arms like the co-op in that case is another investor, and they're getting the same returns as the other investors are getting. Yeah. And they're generally making investments in things that create jobs and increase capacity locally.
Because the reason I'm asking these questions is when it comes to the mixing of the capitalist sector with the cooperative sector, certainly in the UK, it ends up with the absolute swallowing of of cooperative institutions.
No, I think in this case they've been very shrewd. I mean, I have a criticism of it too, so I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I also don't want to be sort of dogmatically critical about it either. So I think they've become very sophisticated investors, and they have sort of mastered the tools of private equity to the benefit of the co-ops that are putting their capital at risk. I think so they're very keen on not doing anything that's going to result in them losing control from a governance perspective. Yeah. So they're bringing in the private capital, and the private capital is subordinate to from a governance perspective.
That sounds like a very
to the
clever
co-op.
balancing act.
I think it is a clever balancing act. And what's the expression? Too clever by half. You know, where sometimes, so for example, in the mid 2000s, I mean, I want to be careful with my words. I don't want to, but I think they got away from themselves where there's a insurance company which expanded into banking called Unipol, and it's controlled by the cooperative movement, but the majority shareholders directly in the bank are not cooperatives. It's through a series of holding companies. And so they've ensured control while leveraging in the finance term outside investments pretty shrewdly. They went and tried to go purchase the former National Bank of Labor Bank in Italy, which was being I guess it had been privatized, but it was sort of the last wave of privatization of the bank, and it ended up turning into a pretty big scandal. And the bank ended up getting bought by BNP Paribas. And so they got a little bit carried away, I think, and caught up in the elegance of the financial maneuvering, and then I think they might have lost sight from a values perspective. It was sort of
a risk, isn't it? It's a big risk if you start to go down that path.
Well, you know, I asked a friend of mine who was a leader in the cooperative movement then. I said, so why are you guys going after this bank? And he goes, why not? You know, sort of like, we have the ability to do it. Why wouldn't we go out and take it? So one of the things that I've noticed happening is, so Unipol, the bank, the insurance company, the bank that I was just telling you about, still owned through these very elegant mechanisms by the cooperative movement. They've now gone into private health insurance, and they're creating private health clinics that will do the same thing that the public sector will do, but they can do them more quickly. And so you're getting this way that you're diverting resources away. It makes sense from an economic perspective for that insurance company to do those things, but you're also diverting resources away from the public health system to a private health system. Some cooperatives, like one of the biggest consumer cooperatives, their business plan explicitly relies on dividends that Unipol pays them to stay in the black. So they're not profitable from their core business. They're only profitable if they get a sizable enough dividend. So there's some ways where there's the danger where this private insurance company controlled by the cooperative movement is becoming a cash cow, maybe, for the cooperative movement. So to me, that's where more of the danger is. It's not in the cooperative that owns it sort of getting carried away by bringing on too many private investors directly into the co-op. That doesn't happen a lot. But it's through these subsidiaries that they control.
Right. So do you think obviously the people in the cooperative movement in Emilia Romagna they're quite shrewd, and they must have a very good understanding of the capitalist world, and they sort of skirt the capitalist world without being absorbed, and that seems like a really really neat skill to have, and maybe that's the secret.
Well, I think, you know, I don't know the details, but I saw some of the headlines about the John Lewis partnership, and they're, you know, demutualizing at least some of that, some in part, in order to attract private investment. Is that more or less what?
I don't know what's happening in the John Lewis movement.
So this was a headline that I saw, and people like Graham Nuttall that write about it. I've read some of their things. So I think there's not a danger of that happening with a cooperative in Italy, because if you demutualize, the capital goes to the cooperative. It doesn't go to the members itself.
Yeah.
But the danger with
also there are asset locks in place to stop that kind of thing happening. That's very important as well, isn't it? Yes. Very,
very important asset locks, where those indivisible reserves, that limited equity you've accumulated over 50, 75, 100 years, if you demutualize, that doesn't stay in the company. It doesn't go to the members. It has to be devolved, they call it, to the cooperative movement. But what an Italian co-op would do if they have to raise capital, they would create a holding company, or they would create a wholly owned subsidiary that could be the vehicle for raising capital.
Right. So the co-op itself is not in danger of being. We have the co-op bank in the UK and the co-op energy, and they're completely being subsumed by capitalists now, and most of our building societies as well.
Yep.
I think it's the same for you with the savings and loans companies in the US.
Yes. Reagan changed the law that allowed them to demutualize.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask. I'm trying to get a flavour of life there. How is life different in Emilia Romagna from the rest of Italy, or or Europe?
Yeah, I think that life is so. If you look at the numbers, unemployment is much lower here than it is elsewhere in Italy. GDP, regional GDP per capita is among the highest, in Europe.
So it's a very successful movement, as well as being a huge part of the economy in Emilia Romagna.
So it's a successful movement, I think, because it's also part of this very dynamic, successful economy. And I think the other piece, so you've got a very strong cooperative movement, which is a part of a unique social partnership model of governance. So decisions get made cooperatively, forgive the pun, between labor representing workers, between the cooperative business associations representing these cooperatives, and between the other employer associations. And so big decisions get made together. There's in 2015, they signed a thing called the Pact for the Economy and Labor. And this was the result of a long period of what's called social dialogue, where there was sort of joint negotiation around priorities. So what do we want employment to look like in the region? What do we want the economy to look like in the region over the next 3 to 5 years? And how are we going to get there? What's the cooperative movement going to do? What's labor going to do? What's business going to do? And what's the regional government going to do? How are we going to use public funds to get there? And they pretty much hit all of their goals between 2015 and 2020. Go ahead.
So the municipality is helpful.
Municipality, the regional government.
Yeah.
It's very cooperative, and I don't mean that in a pun. I mean there's a way that the different constituencies or the stakeholders, through their representatives, really do cooperate on saying, hey, what do we want the future to look like, and how are we going to get there? How are we going to agree together on how we're going to get there? So 2015 to 2020 was this 5-year plan. They created a follow-up to that, which was the Pact on Labor, the Economy, and the Climate. And this is how are we going to go between 2020 and 2030 to decarbonize the economy, create employment, and focus on innovation. So there's also a larger social dialogue that the cooperative movement is both a part of and is a protagonist of.
Yeah. Do you know about the Preston model in the UK? Actually, it came from the US. It came from Cleveland in the US.
Oh, is this the Evergreen cooperatives? Yes. I'm fairly familiar with that. I know the Ohio Employee Ownership Center very well. John Logue, who was one of the people that exposed the Cleveland Institute to Mondragon and that model.
Yes, and and so in Preston, we the local government, when it comes to procuring goods and services for their anchor businesses and institutions in the town, they give preference to small local businesses, and if those small local businesses don't exist, they will help set up co-ops to provide those goods and services. And but I know that we had people on the left criticizing the Preston model because they saw it as potentially as a way privatization by the back door. I mean, I guess they could be right if the co-ops and small businesses they support get bought out eventually by the corporate and financial sector, like the co-op bank or co-op energy and most of the building societies. But really, I mean, Yeah, I'm always talking about moving the economy out of the hands of the state and corporations
Right,
into
right.
the commons and into communities and into cooperatives. And if the left don't support that, what does left and right actually mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, there's a guy named Andre Gores, I think French Austrian philosopher,
Yeah.
and towards the end of his life, he wrote very eloquently, I think, from a solidly left perspective about the need. He saw. I'll make this brief. He saw the rise of the modern welfare state as a response to the shortcomings of capitalism, and so because it was a response to the shortcomings of capitalism, by definition, the modern welfare state has big holes in it. It can't respond to all of our most sort of deeply felt needs at a human level. It can, it's a band-aid, it's a patch on something, but it's not solving the root problem, nor was it designed to. And so you do need to go sort of beyond that. The mirror image of mass production was the modern welfare state. I think that's sort of a crude summary of what he would say. So from a left perspective, he was very supportive, I think, of self-help, of things like community time dollars, alternative, barter models, and cooperative provision of services. And I think what the struggle here is how do we get that right? And so the model here is not, we don't like the state. It's such a radical critique that we don't want, the state can't solve the problems, but it's what's the role for the state? And the state has, part of that role is it directly funds these services that the state may or may not directly provide. And there are some things like healthcare. I think the consensus is the state should provide, in a subsidiary mindset, subsidiarity model, it should provide directly those services. So it's not there's not a big move to privatize, getting your routine colonoscopy, for example, or hospitals or those sorts of things. So the state has a role of funder. It has a role in some cases of directly providing services. And it has a role also of sort of guaranteeing the quality of those services, regardless of who provides that. So
there's certainly in the UK, the provision of the funding, obviously, yes, it comes from taxes, but the provision is, I went for an MRI scan a year ago, and I saw a corporate logo on the scan. And I said, "Who are these people? and who are you? Who are you employed by?" They were employed. The whole unit was owned by Qataris, and I said, "Who are these people?" And they didn't know. They said, like, "Oh, it's all so intricate, we don't really know." And it's like, it's completely outsourced to the private sector, and more so. And I don't see why it can't be outsourced to cooperatives or the commons eventually.
Well, so I think that's to bring it back to co-ops. And I guess what I was trying to say is this is a conversation that's happening right now. And it's, what is the role of the state in the public sector? What is the role of the voluntary nonprofit sector? What's the role of the cooperative movement, particularly in social cooperatives? And that's where you get into the controversy, because back in the 80s and the 90s, you had a phenomenon of families and social workers. I'm using social worker to sort of, largely people who are providing social services, saying, we know that we can do better. I don't want to work in this bureaucratic way. And we know that we can provide better services. So let's create a cooperative that's going to provide these services in a more intimate, in a more customized, and participatory way. So you have the rise of a grassroots movement around social cooperatives. And then in the 90s, I'm going to get the year wrong, but it was 93 or 96, you have a law that actually establishes there is something called a social cooperative, just like there's a worker co-op and a consumer co-op and a farmer co-op. And these are the rules, these are the types. There's two types of social cooperatives. One is a traditional worker co-op where the members are the social workers. And there's a mixed type called the type B, where the members are the workers, but they're also the families or the people receiving the services directly. As a mixed
Yes,
governance model.
that's happening in the UK as well. I'll send you some links to some interesting
Please.
developments over here as well, and
Please do.
I'll put some links in the
I
description.
appreciate that. So that happens, and then all of a sudden the municipalities start to write when they're going to bid out, contracting out public services. I think primarily early on it was, how do we expand the services that we're providing? So let's use social cooperatives for that. And so they wrote the the public tenders in such a way that you had to be a co-op to apply. And it was somehow they figured out how to not skirt EU, liberalization rules.
Yeah.
And now we're in a phase where, all new daycare, it seems like, is being provided through social cooperatives. And they're becoming sort of these larger, less personal sort of behemoths. And it's raising some of those questions that you're talking about. Nobody's afraid that it's going to get privatized through the back door the way you're describing. But if we keep expanding services without expanding the funding available to those services, at what point is this really just about saving money on the backs of the people doing the work? Because someone doing work in a social cooperative, doing the same work that someone for the city is doing, is getting paid less money than someone who's got a city contract.
Can I just ask you what happened in Emilia Romagna after 2008? Did the region sort of fare better than other regions of Italy?
So the region as a whole fared better and recovered more quickly than the region of Italy. And here cooperatives are really important. It's been long established that they're counter-cyclical. So they're less likely to lay off when the crisis hits. What did happen though is the construction industry, the cooperative construction industry, was completely decimated. I mean, it was a real tragedy. And what happened was the construction firms that were focused primarily on the domestic market, the work just bottomed out and they never recovered from it. I mean, they literally disappeared overnight. The civil engineering and construction firms that have exposure to international markets, so one of the oldest co-ops in Italy does a lot of work in Africa around civil engineering projects. They fared relatively well because they had less exposure. They were less impacted by the housing crisis in Italy. What the 2008 crisis did expose some of the weaknesses in the more established cooperatives. And I remember one of my friends who was a manager and sort of not an academic, he doesn't work for a university, but he studies, he has an academic interest in co-ops. He said, the co-ops that did well were the co-ops that had really strong internal democracy and had less exposure, that had more international diversification. The co-ops that had lack of international exposure, so diversification, and had less internal democracy, so there's low turnover on the board, for example, those are the ones that were most at risk. And there was a link in his mind between less internal democracy, so therefore, leadership that was more entrenched and maybe habituated in its ways. Well, we don't need to go out and be competitive internationally because we're more, about maintaining the status quo. So he saw a link between internal democracy and business strategy in this case. And I think you can see that, in what co-ops managed through that crisis effectively and what co-ops didn't. One point I'd want to make, and I think this is something to think about for anybody interested in co-ops, when I started to look at what was happening as a result of the crisis, there were some co-ops that said, we're not going to lay anybody off. we're going to use the internal reserves that we've had to maintain employment. And I said to a friend of mine who worked at the co-op fund, one of those investment funds, I said, wow, what a noble sort of way to respond to the crisis. And he said, well, that's one way to look at it. Or you could look at it as these co-ops are squandering the resources that past generations had bestowed to them. And they're not going to have those resources available for the future generations that will come. And so, did that make sense what I said?
Squandering resources as in hanging on to superfluous workers. Is that what you mean?
Well, so there's one co-op that was a very, very historic. They made windows and doors, wooden windows and doors. And so they were primarily focused on the local Italian housing market, making wooden windows and doors, not using more modern materials. The crisis hits, all of no one's buying doors and windows in 2008, 2009 because no one's building anything. And what they did is they started to go burn through the indivisible reserves, that the limited equity that they accumulated over 75 years to keep the current shareholders employed.
Yeah.
Well, that co-op went out of business.
Right.
So they burned through those reserves. The people still ended up being unemployed.
Yeah.
And that wealth is not there for the community for future generations to come.
That's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I think that's a cautionary tale to me. Number one, I mean, there's something about that link between internal democracy and how much are you focused on staying ahead of the curve in order to stay competitive in these markets so that you have a business model that works, and this balance between your obligations to your present members and to the future members who have yet to join the cooperative.
Yeah. I've got to get one final question in.
Please.
Is this cooperative ingredient in Emilia Romagna something that can be replicated or emulated elsewhere, or is it baked into the culture and unique?
Here's my answer to the question is a question, and it's why not? If a group, fundamentally, the cooperatives that, the really historic ones that were started in the late 1800s and the immediate post-war period, it was a group of people who had a common problem, and it was employment, it was their ability to feed themselves, it was access to meaningful work. They had a common problem, and they said, we're going to solve our common problem in common. And we're just going to figure it out. And maybe we're not going to get paid right away. And maybe, we're willing to make these sacrifices, but we're going to do this because we want to solve the common problems that we have in common. I talked about the indivisible reserves of this limited equity model, which a lot of people, when they first come here and they study the cooperative, they say, oh, that's why it's successful, because there's a law that requires them to do that, and they get a tax benefit for doing it. Well, the law came, I think 70 years after the practice first started. And so by reducing the tax burden on those co-ops, it created a mechanism of self-financing. But that's not why the co-ops had been doing this for 70 years. Yeah. They were doing this because it was the right thing to do, and it was a way to put into practice a model
the other way around. The laws came into existence because that had been happening for 70 years.
Exactly. So I don't see why people who are faced with common problems today can't solve their problems in common. There were some really key leaders. You could probably make a list of 10 or 20 people, most of them men, who between 1860 and 1960 made decisions that were really decisive for the development of the cooperative movement.
That doesn't mean women couldn't have done it as well. It was just they were sort of held back in that time period.
Yes, absolutely. No, that was not a comment on the ability of women to provide that leadership. But there's something about leadership and not waiting for, I think, somebody else to solve your problem.
Yeah, that's music to my ears, because there's ideas emerging that I want to get out there, and I want to help people do exactly that in their own town. And
so,
yeah, go on.
so I mean, just to, this is not linked specifically to the co-ops, but the co-ops are a big part of this. I want to come back to that pact on the labor, the economy, and the labor and the climate. There's lots of regions and countries in the world that are saying, oh my God, these problems are huge. We need somebody else to solve it. And the cooperative movement, the mainstream businesses, labor, and government came together and said, we've got a shared crisis in terms of the climate crisis. We have to solve this. And we bet that we can decarbonize the economy in a way that makes us even more innovative, even more competitive, and creates even more good jobs. And they've gotten together and said, that's what we're going to do. And here's our goals, and here's how we're going to do it. And so Emilia Romagna, Bologna is home to one of the top 5 most powerful supercomputers in the world. And the supercomputers are going to be used to the benefit of co-ops doing, innovation and technology development. They're going to be available to universities and the private sector, but they're also making the supercomputing capability that's here in Bologna available to the local health system, local governments who are trying to solve social problems. And so we're going to decarbonize by getting really innovative and creating really good jobs. And so I think that's a reflection of that spirit that goes back to the 1800s, the immediate post-war period, that is still alive today. And that's sort of cooperation, maybe on a more meta level.
Any sources of information for people who are interested in looking more into the history of cooperation in Emilia Romagna?
Yeah,
I think books or websites or
anything by Vera, V-E-R-A, like the name Vera Negri, Negri, or Stefano Zamagni, Zamagni. They've written a lot in English. Vera is the economic historian. Stefano is the economic theorist. I've written some things. One is called the Communist Party in the Land of Cooperation, and it was looking at the link between politics and, in particular, how did the left interpret their vision and apply that to the cooperatives here. And then I wrote actually a small book called Compete to Cooperate, about the cooperative movement in Imola, which is IMOLA, which is one of the real strong centers of the cooperative movement within the region here.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, that's fantastic. Any links would be very gratefully received, and
I'll be happy to send you those links.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Matt, it's been great speaking with you.
It's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope it was useful to you and to the people who participate in low impact.
It was great. It was really useful, and yeah, we'll get it up on the site in a few weeks, and I'll send you a link. And yeah, I'd love to keep in touch and exchange ideas.
Me too. Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. Bye-bye.